Welcome, first of all. So my name is Lise Jaillant. I'm a reader in digital humanities at Loughborough University, and I'm also the principal investigator for the Luster project. So as many of you know, Luster is about unlocking digital records with artificial intelligence. We are very interested in government records, and we want to bring together government professionals, digital humanists, computer scientists, all kinds of people who are interested in those issues. So this is our fourth talk, and we are very happy to welcome Professor Helen McCarthy, who's a professor of history at University of Cambridge, and the title of her talk today is Exploring the Digital Records of Everyday Life in COVID-era Britain. So welcome, Helen, and yeah, feel free to start. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be talking to this group. And I must stress, I'm a historian of modern Britain. I don't consider myself to be a digital historian or a digital humanities scholar of any kind. And my lack of expertise in those fields will become palpably clear very quickly. But I am a scholar who's interested in thinking historically about the very recent past and thinking about the challenge presented by the born digital record. And I've tried in a fairly modest way to integrate these themes into my teaching, trying to get students to think about what it might mean to study the past through a born digital archive. And I've tried to engage with new developments in archival practice concerning the preservation of and means of access to different kinds of born digital records, both in government and beyond, which is why it's so great to be talking to this network today. I'm now going to share my screen, and hopefully you will see my PowerPoint slides very quickly, very soon. Okay, and please shout out and tell me if this is going wrong. Okay, so yes, so I'm very interested in the born digital record, but I have to admit that up to now in my own research, I've not really had call to make extensive or particularly intensive use of born digital records. And this is because for most contemporary historians, at least in my field of modern Britain, serious empirical study of the recent period is only really just beginning to arrive at the 1990s. So in recent years, there's been quite a groundswell of interest in the field in rethinking the history of the 1970s and the 1980s, lots of new scholarship in those decades. And now there is an emerging literature on the 1990s, for which, of course, government records are now available at the National Archives. I and a colleague at Queen Mary, David Geiringer, ran a series of workshops about a year or two ago on Britain in the 1990s and are currently editing a special issue on this subject. But what was really striking to us as we sort of gathered in lots of abstracts and papers from people who wanted to get involved was just how little use was being made of born digital sources. For the most part, the archives that these historians were working with were paper archives, from the records of central government to the campaigning literature produced by NGOs to the handwritten or typed responses of mass observers. There is one exception to this rule, which I've put on my slide, which I must alert you to, which is a wonderful article by David Geiringer and James Baker, which looks at the transition within the Mass Observation Project, which is a life writing project based in Sussex, at the University of Sussex, the transition from handwritten and typewriter typed submissions to submissions that were written on word processors. And there's sort of really interesting reflections on what this change means for the ways in which mass observers produce forms of testimony for the archive. And also very interesting on the place of the PC in the domestic space. Now, of course, once historians reach the 2000s, they really will have to grapple with email archives, with the archive web, with personal digital archives. They'll have to think about mobile phones and people accessing the internet and email on the move. They'll have to really grasp the world that our students studying at university, studying history, undergraduates studying history right now, the world that they have grown up in. And it was in fact thinking about my students that sparked the idea which forms the basis of my presentation today. So a few months ago, I started prepping a new undergraduate module, which is going to run next year, on contemporary history. And it's a second year module, and the idea is to have quite a focus on primary sources, and to get students thinking about the different kinds of sources that historians work with, and in particular the archive of the contemporary historian, what kinds of sources we use to study the recent past. And I was very keen to include a session which would allow students to think about another challenge, which is quite peculiar to the contemporary historian, which is the challenge of thinking historically about events which oneself as a historian has actually lived through and has first-hand experience of. And of course, if you are teaching 19 and 20-year-olds, you can't go back very far to find events of that kind. And so it struck me that COVID-19 was an obvious choice of subject. And the pandemic has, of course, been extensively historicized already. You might remember back in March 2020, all of these historians or historically minded journalists and commentators kind of popping up to place the pandemic in some kind of longer term perspective, comparing it to previous pandemics, situating it in longer histories of public health crises. Historians have also been thinking about the pandemic in relation to environmental history and what it tells us about interspecies encounters. And that's all terribly interesting and stimulating, but that kind of historical analysis has not been very archivally engaged, for the obvious reason that in March 2020 the archive was taking form, and since then large chunks of the archive have not been available to researchers. That, of course, is changing in the UK, as was dominating news headlines yesterday. The official COVID inquiry is underway and will run until 2026. And that process will generate a huge amount of new evidence, as well as gathering together official records from the pandemic, some of which, as we know, the Cabinet Office is not very keen to hand over. And for those of us interested in born digital records, I think this inquiry is going to be very revealing of record keeping practices within government in the digital age. And it's already been very revealing as to the widespread use of WhatsApp by ministers and officials during the early phases of the pandemic, when it appears to have been really the most important medium of communication and also to some extent decision making. But of course, there's the real question mark over the preservation of material like WhatsApp. And that will be fascinating to see how that works out. And the inquiry itself, when it reports, will of course contain a great deal of historical analysis. It will establish facts, it will lay down timelines, it will explore how policies were developed, it'll name the key players and so on, very much with a view towards learning lessons for the future. And this, of course, will all be of huge interest and significance for contemporary historians. But the politics of the pandemic, the policy focus of the official inquiry is not, of course, the only lens through which historians will want to make sense of the pandemic. And as I continue to plot my undergraduate module session in my head, I became increasingly preoccupied with the social and cultural history of the pandemic, or more specifically, the everyday experience of living through the era of COVID-19. What will the archive be able to tell us about what it was like to be alive in Britain in 2020 when COVID-19 arrived and ordinary life was upended? How will historians reconstruct what I'm calling the COVID everyday? What sources will be available to them, and how important are born digital records in this archival landscape? And these are the questions that I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk. So I'll proceed by mapping in a very kind of rough and ready way the archive of the COVID everyday. I'll then go into a bit more detail on the place of digital records within that archive. And then I'm going to discuss a number of challenges that I've encountered as a non-digital specialist working with this material, challenges relating to the conditions of preservation and access for future scholars, and challenges relating to methods of interpretation. And I must emphasize that I've been dipping in and out of a selected range of digital sources over the past sort of 6 weeks or so. I've not studied this archive systematically or exhaustively. I think you'd need a very big grant in order to do this. So this is a provisional exploration, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and feedback as I develop this further. So what does the archive of the COVID everyday look like? And it was very striking that right from the earliest stages of the virus in the UK, efforts were being made to record and capture and preserve how ordinary people were experiencing a rapidly shifting reality. And some of this was individuals entirely unprompted, deciding to keep diaries, deciding to start a blog, deciding to undertake various creative projects. But there were others who responded to call-outs from institutions which had a remit to collect and preserve. And the British Library has identified over 100 COVID-themed initiatives launched by archives, museums, charities and universities. And the BL was itself at the forefront of these efforts, archiving COVID-related websites, collecting oral histories from NHS workers, offering a home to the BBC's Listening Project, partnering with a major ESRC funded project on children's play during lockdown. And there is this amazing document that has been compiled by BL curators, listing all of these projects on an Excel spreadsheet and supplying lots of useful information about them. And you can download it from their website, and it's a sort of gives you a wonderful picture of just how much archiving activity was sparked by the pandemic. And if you look through this spreadsheet, what I find very striking about it is just how creative and inclusive this mass archiving moment was in 2020. And just to give you a flavour of what it contains, the Museum of London captured Muslim experiences of Ramadan under lockdown through a specially created WhatsApp group, which generated thousands of messages, videos, voice notes and photographs over a 30-day period. A collective writing project called Journals of a Pandemic launched an open call for diarists in April 2020, appealing to, quote, those not well represented in the mainstream media. The University of Edinburgh's Lothian Diary projects collected video and audio material from 195 participants representing, quote, a wide range of neighbourhoods, occupations, ages, ethnicities, nationalities, gender identities, sexual orientations, political opinions and types of disability. Oral histories were undertaken with British Chinese citizens. Projects were funded with Latin American citizens in London. Queer Distance was launched by Our Stories Scotland to record the experiences of LGBTQ+ people. The lives of 6 members of the deaf community were depicted in a video diary project led by the British Sign Language Broadcasting Trust. It goes on and on and on. There's just a huge amount of richness and inclusivity in that spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet is brilliant, but it's actually not exhaustive. I've identified quite a few more projects which were setting out to capture people's ordinary lives and their everyday experiences. And these kinds of initiatives were also happening in other countries. And some of the UK-based projects had a global dimension, soliciting material from people all over the world. And they were able to do this not simply because the pandemic was itself a global phenomenon, but because so much of the material that people were generating about their lived experiences took a digital form. And before talking a bit more about those digital records, just a quick caveat. This archive, of course, is not exclusively digital. I was quite struck by the number of archives that were also looking to collect material objects. So Museums Worcestershire suggested that local residents might donate homemade face masks made on sewing machines for NHS or care workers, or pots and wooden spoons used to bang during claps for carers. Another local archive collected beer glasses and beer mats from a virtual pub run by the community during lockdown. The Victoria and Albert Museum have launched a major collecting initiative of rainbow artwork created by children and put in windows. So there is a material element to this archive which is really important. Nonetheless, the pivot to virtual worlds necessitated by the virus did encourage digital archiving practices. I mean, on a very basic level, most archives ask people to email their written submissions or to submit them via online forms. Blogging really came into its own as a form for the written expression and sharing of personal testimony. Archives also solicited audio and video files, particularly where there was a sense that this would be more inclusive, allowing more people to participate, people who perhaps weren't so comfortable writing. And perhaps most important of all were testimonies that took a visual form, and particularly photography. And as scholars such as Annabella Pollen and Paul Lowe have observed, the social experience of COVID-19 quickly acquired an arresting visual quality. I'm quoting Pollen here, from new visual languages of official public health messaging to spontaneous acts of creativity, from window art to street graffiti to representations of masking and social distancing. With smartphone ownership approaching 90% in 2020 to 2021, the taking and sharing of photographs was a near universal practice, and one which inspired crowdsourced initiatives such as Historic England's Picturing Lockdown and the National Portrait Gallery's Hold Still. Photography features in well over half of the projects listed in the BL database, and we also find it working alongside the written text in many sources. So Pollen has looked at the work that visual imagery is doing in responses to Mass Observation's Coronavirus Directive, which it issued in March 2020. And we also find many blogs making heavy use of photographic imagery to illustrate the text. And I think Annabella Pollen is absolutely right when she says that historians wishing to reconstruct everyday experiences of the pandemic will have to become much better acquainted with visual methods of interpretation. And they will also have to become acquainted with the challenges of using born digital sources, which I won't sort of go through in a general way because I'm sure that the peculiar qualities of the born digital source is familiar to you all. But I just want to instead discuss a few particular challenges that have presented themselves to me as I've been exploring this archive of the COVID everyday. I've spent quite a bit of time recently with the UK Web Archive's COVID-19 collection, and was very helpfully directed by Nicola Bingham at the BL. And Nicola might be on this call, if you are, hi, towards a published interview that she gave back in 2020, explaining the scope of that collection. And as she explains in this interview, the COVID collection is in line with the archive's general collection policies. So it's primarily a collection of websites with some social media content, although there are technical limitations in using social media. And this is one challenge which, as a non-specialist in relation to digital humanities, I feel I need to understand better. So the UK Web Archive lists quite a lot of Twitter feeds mostly of politicians, of journalists, of public health experts, rather than the sort of ordinary tweeter. But trying to actually access this content is quite difficult, and I'm somewhat unsure as to exactly what the status of the social media content in the COVID collection and in the UK Web Archive more broadly actually is. So I feel this is something that I need to understand so that we can think about how the social historian of the future, what kind of access they will have to this massive arena for human self-expression. So I'm sort of interested in where social media is going to go in terms of archives. However, even without social media, the UK Web Archive COVID collection will be an absolute treasure trove for the future historian of the pandemic. And alongside a great number of organisational websites from government departments, public authorities, universities, local councils and so on, I've counted about 24 sites in the collection which contain what might be called pandemic-themed life writing by individuals, and which therefore we might see as sort of forming part of the archive of everyday life. Some of these websites are drawn from longer-running blogs, such as Biking to Work, the creation of an NHS nurse, and as he calls himself, sometimes bad-tempered dad to 2 sons who break things, or the nature blog Nat in the Wild, which showed people how they can experience the wild in their back gardens or neighbourhoods and the benefits of doing so, a blog that was started very early in 2020 and then very quickly became quite pandemic and lockdown themed. Others were entirely new blogs inspired by the lockdowns. So children's illustrator Esther Kent started blogging in March 2020 during a short city break in Rome with her young family, and she called her blog No More Roaming. A London-based travel editor called Annie Warren started a Corona journal on the Substack platform. Another NHS nurse in Scotland, who calls herself Ruby Tuesday 18, started writing her Corona diaries, and a junior doctor in Edinburgh began a blog called One Doc Story. And of course, it's really fantastic that these websites are being preserved by the UK Web Archive. But again, I felt a degree of uncertainty as I engaged with this material as a historian used to working with historical sources, because of their dynamic and interactive nature, the hallmark, of course, of the archived web. Most of these sites that I've just mentioned still exist on the web now, and those live versions look rather different from the versions available through the UK Web Archive, and they also look different from the versions accessible through the Wayback Machine on the Internet Archive, which I've been making quite a lot of use of as I've had sort of limited opportunities to actually get inside the BL and use the Web Archive from inside the reading rooms. And as I'm sure you all know, archived websites can be quite glitchy. They are limited in terms of displaying images and video, and it's quite unnerving as a researcher to be studying or have available to you the live version of a website in its sort of full richness, whilst knowing that the future historian will probably have access to a version that is not the same. And just to kind of give you an example of this, this is the Boredom 19 project was a digital zine produced by teenagers based in Chelmsford in Essex during the 2020 lockdown. And the website, the image on the right is what the website looks like at the moment. This is the live website, and the Wayback Machine version is the one on the left. So as you can see, massive loss of detail and content there. And then another example might be the Corona Journal that I mentioned before by Annie Warren. It's also still up on the internet, and it looks like this on the right. But if you go through the UK web archived version, you can see it's massively sort of attenuated in terms of visual features. And as I say, I find this radical uncertainty as to exactly what the future historian, say in 2030 or 2040, might be able to access quite hard to get my head around. And of course, paper archives are not totally stable. Buildings get flooded or they burn down. Collections can be closed overnight for legal reasons. But nonetheless, I somehow find those risks easier to deal with than what, in the case of web archives, at least seems to be a kind of structural condition of future loss. I mean, maybe the web archiving technology will just become much better. And again, I'm sure there are people on this call who can enlighten me on this point. Finally, final section of my talk to methods and interpretive strategies. I've already mentioned the importance of visual literacy, as noted by Pollen, but I thought, given present company and the network's interest in AI, that it might be interesting to explore whether this kind of archive could be susceptible to big data approaches. And I'll be very honest again here about my own limited expertise. I mean, my work to date has adopted the conventional methods of immersive close reading of texts and intensive engagement with archival material. And I've worked mostly as a lone scholar. And this is what I've sort of instinctively done as I've begun to explore this archive of the COVID every day, which is extremely rich and very varied and very eclectic in terms of the kinds of material that we find in it. I do think that one could potentially use corpus linguistics tools to analyse the written components. So if we're thinking about pandemic life writing as constituting a corpus, one could map trends in language, perhaps identify keywords and phrases that people are using to describe their everyday experience. We might be able to see how far the language of government health messaging sort of turns up in people's testimonies. Something that I've become aware of through my close reading of a small selection of pandemic life writing sources is the use of what I would call other regarding registers of expression. So there's a great deal of reflecting on the suffering of people in less fortunate circumstances. There's a lot of recounting of acts of kindness, often involving random strangers in public spaces. Many of these writers address their readers directly. So Ruby Tuesday 18, the NHS nurse in Scotland, always signs off her blog posts with a motivational greeting. Stay strong, folks. Hang on in there. Be kind. And Annie Warren, author of the Corona Journal Substack, she's often sharing tips for things to read. She's often sort of saying, sharing ideas for things people might like to watch on Netflix. She's recommending recipes. She's asking for their feedback about what sort of content would be they would enjoy. So that's interesting, and I think could potentially be tracked at scale. And there is also, as you might expect, quite a lot of emotional suffering expressed in these texts. References to stress, to fear, unhappiness, frustration, boredom. Although interestingly, the expression of misery or despair is often caveated with acknowledgement of one's relative privilege. The sociologist Lisa McKenzie, who recruited a group of working class diarists in the first lockdown, commented on this when she was surveying material that they sent her. She says everyone acknowledged the difficulties of their own situation, but the sense that it could be worse was always included somewhere. Even when situations were absolutely heart-wrenching and miserable, there was always an awareness that there was someone worse off. And I think we could describe this as a kind of moral accounting. that in pandemic life writing, and something that we could definitely track, as I say, kind of track at scale, and also to do so into 2021. I mean, I've looked mostly at sources in 2020, but I do think that there is sort of an interesting shift in 2021 with the rolling out of the vaccine programme and potential lockdown fatigue setting in. I would, however, still defend conventional close reading methods for qualitative, rich material of this kind. I think online or handwritten, a diary really needs to be read carefully and sensitively all the way through and situated in the relevant contexts. And I think this is also true of interactive content, which one finds in many of the blogs, with readers leaving comments and authors responding to comments, and which really sort of gives us an insight into the community of readers that might grow up around a particular digital text. And this reinforces my conviction, and this is really my last point, that what we're dealing with here is an archive of feeling. I borrow this term from the historian Matt Cook, who borrows it from the historian Anne Spetkovich, who uses it to describe the complex accumulation of emotion in cultural texts, produced in her case through lesbian and gay lives and politics in the US in the 1980s and 90s. And Matt Cook repurposes it as a phrase for his own work on queer lives in the UK over the same period. But I think it could be deployed also in relation to COVID-19. And I don't have space to develop this point in any detail, but I think all of those archiving efforts that I described earlier were really being driven forward in spring, summer 2020 by what I would label as an ethic of care. So whether an individual blogger or a local record office collecting material, these testimony projects really seem to have a dual purpose in the pandemic. They set out to record the crisis, but also to help people to respond to it. And I just thought I would finish with just sharing some of the phrases that form part of these call outs from institutions in 2020, looking to encourage people to record their everyday experience. And as you can see, they're asking you to donate everyday objects that have helped you get through the pandemic. Maybe you're keeping a diary or taken up a new hobby. You might have started a support group, put a rainbow in your window, or recorded your streets clap for carers. One archive describes itself as a place to share creative responses to the situation and your thoughts on how we can best look after ourselves during this time. So I think that when historians do come to study this archive seriously, both the born digital records inside it and the paper and material objects that sit alongside them, they really need to be mindful of this ethic of care that I see really animating and shaping this archive. Okay, I will stop there and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Helen. That was absolutely fascinating. And everybody, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. But perhaps I could start with the first question, really, because, I mean, as you know, Helen, it's very difficult to access many of those born digital records. And there was an interesting comment in the chat from Nicola Bingham saying that sometimes you have to go to the reading room, for example, the British Library reading room, to actually look at those materials that were once freely available online. So could you perhaps expand a little bit about access and the difficulties to access those materials, you know, as a historian, as a humanities scholar?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I have the good fortune of working for the University of Cambridge, which is a deposit library. And I thought, oh, great, so I can just pop along to the UL to access the web archive. But I have to say, when I got there seemed to be quite a lot of confusion amongst the library staff as to which terminals I had to go to in order to access this source. And then when I actually got there, it wasn't, for various technical reasons, it wasn't working. So I couldn't actually access the web archive from my own institution. So yeah, I've been down to British Library a couple of times and gone into the reading room to access the web archive, and it is you know, it's quite slow. It's, you know, this isn't a criticism, by the way, which is like amazing that it exists. It's like just mind-blowing the amount of data that is involved and the amount of labor involved. So it's amazing that this isn't a criticism, but it is very slow. It is quite glitchy. And like I said, my efforts to access the social media content, the Twitter feeds that are listed in the collection, you know, there was just nothing was actually coming up when I tried to access those, and that's sort of what, yeah, I mean, it made me feel very nervous for the future. As a historian, you know, you're very aware of just how reliant you are on archives, and the kind of the terrifying thought that you might not be able to access something is quite hard to manage. So yes, I mean, it is obviously very limiting that one has to, and that's why I've been using the Internet Archive quite a lot. But that is also, I also feel the kind of precariousness of that as a source as well, and whether I'll be able to access tomorrow what I was able to access today. It's kind of unnerving as a researcher.
Great, thank you so much, Helen. Do we have other questions in the chat? Not yet. Well, everyone, I really encourage you to ask your questions in the chat if you have any. I'm sure there are many questions here. But let me ask you another question, Helen, about methodology, because you mentioned the fact that, of course, we have a lot of records, born digital records, and it can be difficult to use close reading, you know, traditional methods that we use in the humanities. So do you see a change in the way perhaps young historians or, you know, early career researchers are approaching these materials? I mean, do you see this kind of methodological change, or are people still using very traditional methods?
Well, the problem is that most historians aren't using these kinds of sources at all yet, because you'd have to be working on extremely contemporary, you know, you need to be working, you know, on the 2000s and beyond in order to be engaging intensively with these sources. So the answer to that is no. I am beginning to see. So I edited a journal for a while, and, you know, you were beginning to see historians sort of dropping archived web sources sort of into more kind of into scholarship that adopted more conventional archival methods, but not like I say, like not in a kind of intensive engagement. I mean, there is a little bit by historians, but it's just very limited. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a generational thing. I think it's actually to do with whether you work on the period after 1995 or not, really. And if you don't, then you don't really have to worry about it. And if you have no plans to, then you don't really need to worry about it very much.
Great, thank you so much, Helen. So we have a question from Alice Austin in the chat. Could you talk more about the ethical challenges of using these personal narratives in historical research? Because sometimes we are talking about very personal things, right, on blogs and social media. So would you like to expand a little bit about this?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's something I've really thought about, because I'm sort of trying to write something about this, and I'm very conscious of drawing on people's lockdown experiences that they're writing about, often in quite honest, sort of open, honest, detailed, revelatory ways. I mean, the two blogs that I mentioned by Annie Warren and Ruby Tuesday 18. So they have both been archived by the Web Archive, and actually, interestingly, halfway through her blog, I think May 2020, Ruby Tuesday 18 actually says on her blog, "Wow, the British Library want to archive my blog. This is so amazing. Like, in the future, people will be able to, you know, people are going to be interested in what I've got to say." And that's, you know, that's kind of interesting to me, because I then think, you know, from that point on, she's writing her blog sort of in the knowledge that it's being archived by the British Library, and, you know, it's turned into a historical document. I mean, I don't think actually it really changes the character of the blog. I mean, I've read it all the way through, and I don't think and she's someone who actually is also a contributor to Mass Observation. So she's someone who is a kind of veteran life writer. You know, this is something that she does. It's something she enjoys. It's something that it's part of her kind of practice in terms of kind of a kind of technology of the self. If you think of life writing as a technology of the self, it's something that she's very kind of skilled in. So she's already doing that. So I don't think there's an ethical issue with that, because she's, you know, she's writing, as I say, she's writing for an audience. I mean, there are others where, well, I mean, I do think this is an interesting question as to whether, you know, the onlineness of a testimony sort of makes a difference in terms of how we handle it. I mean, I was talking to an academic acquaintance of mine who kept a Facebook diary. She wrote her diary on Facebook for a year during COVID. And that was interesting because she it was basically being read by about 200 people, all of whom she knew. Some of them she knew much better than others, but they were the people on Facebook who had access to her daily diary. So it wasn't a private diary. I mean, it was clearly being written for an audience, but nor was it. But she said she was very clear that she wasn't going to make it. She wasn't just going to post it on the internet. You know, it was going to be something that had a kind of, it was being written sort of within a community. So although she also said that she will probably put it in an archive at some point. So she sort of had a sense of it as a, you know, as a valuable historical document that could be that could be made available to a wider group. So yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested in other people's views on this point of ethics.
Great, thank you so much, Helena. We have another question from Glyn Jones, who asks about the diversity of information, because of course you talk about the WhatsApp records, you know, you talk about the web archive, there are so many sources. So do you have any views on how we can approach the current diversity of information? How can we make sense of those diverse archives?
Yeah, I'm really struck by that. I think it's an archive of feeling. It's also an archive of multitudes. It's just so eclectic. I mean, I think I mean, I've talked about pandemic life writing as though it sort of has as though that's a kind of genre within the archive that we can turn into a corpus, or that we could sort of read as one type of thing. And that may not be right. I mean, it may turn out that that's just not, that even within the written, even when we're talking about COVID era sort of written ego documents, there, you know, a blog is very different from a diary that someone might send to an archive, but they want it to be closed for 50 years. You know, those obviously are two different kinds of written documents. So I think that's right. I mean, I think that historians obviously just need to contextualize the use of different technologies within through which people are producing these narratives. So, you know, to understand how WhatsApp is, you know, how WhatsApp is, the practices that are around, you know, the practices around these technologies. So the more kind of ethnographic stuff about blogging as a practice, and it's kind of the technology, the self stuff, you know, blogging as a practice, and the use of social media, how social media is kind of a practice, and sort of what Annabella Pollen says about photography, you know, understanding, and there's some really quite rich scholarship already actually on photographic practices during the first lockdown, on sort of how people were sort of using photography to document, but also to reach out and connect with others. And so sort of understanding the kind of ethnographic practices, I guess, around the production of these kinds of testimonies across different platforms.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Emily Bogan about international comparisons, because Helen, you talked about the British context, but of course many other countries were impacted by COVID, you know, all around the world. So can we perhaps think about international comparison and how we could use perhaps tools such as AI, you know, to compare those records across various countries?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in that. I'd love to do that. I mean, I don't have very much information about it. I mean, I did look at it, but I haven't mapped that. I haven't mapped that in any systematic way. I mean, that could be the next thing that I do. I mean, I'm aware of some sort of flagship projects. So the New York Public Library had a big diary project, although interestingly, it was exclusively audio. They only wanted audio. So that, you know, that's interesting, like why audio? And there are sort of various other projects that I was aware of, and as I say, you know, actually some of the UK-based projects are actually quite global. So there's a blog, one of the blogs that was set up, it's a kind of collective blog called Plague 20 Journal, which again is being archived by the UK Web Archive, which was a collection, a woman in Norfolk called Margaret, so don't know anything more about her, and she decided to set up this blog, and she invited kind of friends and asked them to invite their friends to write on a regular basis. And so it's a series of blogs for sort of each week. There's a series of them writing, and some of them are writing, a lot of them writing from America, some of them writing from Australia. So there's a sort of reflecting her, I guess, her social networks, that she's, you know, that she asks a friend in New York to contribute to her blog in Norfolk. So you can, you know, that's really interesting, the kind of the globalness of the pandemic and how far that's reflected in the way that these archiving practices are working. And also, I guess, you know, how people are situating themselves in kind of time and history and place in their own testimonies, that sense of actually living through a kind of a global event.
Great, fantastic. So we have many people putting comments about collections all around the country about, you know, COVID materials that were gathered during the first lockdown. Sorry?
Please. Will you be saving the chat? Because I'm sort of looking through it, and I'd love to kind of capture all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. We can absolutely save the chat and put this on our website. No problem at all. Yeah, it's a wonderful you know, list of resources. So thank you so much to everyone for putting this in the chat. Also, Cecilia, who's a postdoc on the Luster project, had a question about the evolution in the tone that people use to describe their experience. So you mentioned the kindness, you know, during the first lockdown. Did you see perhaps an evolution when people started to access vaccines, you know, and perhaps, you know, the context changed a little bit?
So I don't know, because I haven't done that yet. That's the next thing I want to do. So I actually want to see, because I've been focusing on, like I said, this is something that I've been doing over the last 6 weeks. So so I haven't got a big grant to kind of be, I haven't, you know, and I've been but I would really like to look at what happens into 2021 for a number of reasons. Partly because I think, you know, if we think about sort of structures of feeling shaping archival practices in spring, summer 2020, which I think is a helpful way of thinking about it, and how those structures of feeling are then shifting with subsequent lockdowns and the rolling out of the vaccines, I think we can expect to see changes in the kinds of testimonies in the kind of the scripts, if you like, that we find in these testimonies. But I can't tell you, I don't know yet. But there's something else which I so far have not found at all in the ones that I've read for 2020 is long COVID, chronic illness. So that people don't seem to be writing about that, but I'm sure that that becomes part of the kind of COVID every day as we go towards the end of 2020 and into 2021. So lived experience of long COVID, of chronic illness, I think will become, I mean, I want to see if that happens. So I think we definitely, and also whether people just write less. I know that the Oxford Centre for Life Writing ran a project called Live, which was a life writing project, and I know the woman who was running it, Katie Collins, she told me that the submissions kind of tailed off. So into 2021, fewer people were writing. So I think there is something that's potentially quite distinctive about the early pandemic testimony projects, and it may be that 2020 will actually be much better documented than 2021 from the perspective of everyday life.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Jake about archival versions of websites. So you mentioned some issues with those archival versions. Do you have perhaps any advice for archivists on how to make those limitations clear to historians, to scholars, to other users?
Yeah. Well, we definitely need to be educated, and I think we need to be educated in a language that we understand, I suppose. I mean, what I try to do with my students, so I get my students to sort of play around with the government web archive and get them sort of, which I think is for some of them, it's a bit of a revelation to see what websites used to look like, or to actually think about websites as documents that have sources that pass through different iterations, and that we can't just talk about them in the singular. We have to sort of pluralize them if we're sort of thinking about them as a historical source. So I think actually the more that historians can just actually experience web archiving, and like I say, the problem is that most historians don't work. Their research isn't on the 1990s and beyond, so they don't really have much incentive to do this. So it's something that I really want. I just think it should be a real, for contemporary historians, it really ought to be absolutely top of our priorities to understand the archived web.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have a final questions in the chat? Some more resources about COVID-related materials. Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so if we don't have any final questions, I really want to thank you, Helen, for giving this fascinating talk. I want to thank also Cecilia, who really did a lot of background work, to organize the talk. So thank you so much, Cecilia. So in terms of next steps, so we are going to put some of those resources, on our website so that it's accessible to everyone. And also next month, we are going to organize a workshop. It will be our third Luster workshop in Belfast. So keep an eye on our listserv. If you're not a member of the listserv already, well, I encourage you to join, because that's the best way to keep in touch with us and to know more about our project and the events. And again, thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, Cecilia. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.